All right, so hi there, for those of you on the call and for those of you that might be watching another time. We're going to talk about PCI compliance today. I have been in the field of cybersecurity since 2011, and before that I was in IT for really a long time before that, and I actually got exposed to PCI probably initially about 2007. Actually, we had an organization that had credit card numbers as part of credit counseling services in the US. And so we had to start looking at PCI compliance, even though all of those credit card numbers were actually no longer active because the people were in credit counseling and working on paying them all off. But anyway, I went to work at Equifax, which, as you can imagine, has a lot of credit card numbers. And I left there and moved to Sephora in San Francisco, which is a massive retailer. And we had a massive PCI scope, for want of a better term. I think we had, I don't know, 44 million credit card numbers that we were dealing with that we ended up tokenizing. So I did a lot of PCI for a while, and I don't do quite as much of it anymore. I do have a few courses on LinkedIn Learning, which I think you do have to have access to LinkedIn Learning, which through Premium or through your work or through whatever to access them. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a course that will be remarkably similar to the, although much shorter, to the safeguarding PCI. It's called safeguarding credit card data and PCI compliance or something. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you an overview of credit cards and payments. And for those of you that have done any shopping, might be familiar with this, and then a little bit about PCI compliance. I'm going to try and share my screen. So if you have a question, raise your hand. If I miss it, that's just because I've got too many screens going, and so I'll try and catch up at the end. So let me see if I can even do any of the sharing right. So do you see a screen that says PCI compliance?
Yeah, we've got the presentation.
Okay, yes. Now, nailed it. Right. So the question is whether I can actually maintain that throughout the thing with moving to it. I'm not very good at doing the two-screen sharing business, but anyway, I'm going to try it. So we're specifically talking today about PCI DSS compliance, which is data security standards. There are a lot of different parts to PCI compliance, including payment transaction security, end-to-end encryption. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. We're really just dealing with the bit that speaks to merchants, because that's what we're going to talk about, is around credit cards and merchant impact. So how does using a credit card work, right? So we probably, I would imagine, all used one in some shape or form, whether as a card, as a back in the day, as a swipe card, back in the day, as a knuckle dragger machine. You know, I remember those. So basically, with cards in this particular image, it says verified by Visa. There are obviously different card brands that we're going to go into briefly later. When you use your credit card now, the merchant sends it to the payment processor. The payment processor says, yes, they can use their card. This has not been reported as fraudulent. It has available balance. You can take the things that you're trying to buy. And that's it kind of in a nutshell. But obviously, there's a lot more to it, technically speaking. So what is on a card? So again, we've probably all got a card. A lot of us are using virtual cards, digital wallets, but we've probably been given a physical card at some point. The PAN is the payment account number, and that indicates the associated account. It's usually 15 or 16 digits, typically 15 with American Express, 16 with others. If you have a store card, so this happens a lot in America where I lived for a long time. You might get a store card. So let's say you go to, I don't know, I'm going to make it up. Let's say you go to Home Goods, and Home Goods has a store card, and that card has maybe 10 digits on it. That is not part of PCI compliance. PCI only deals with cards associated with card brands. So Visa, MasterCard, American Express, JCB, which does Diners Club. I think there is another one, but for some reason I'm having just drawing a blank. But if it's a store card, although the numbers and the cards might be protected in the same way, they are not liable for PCI compliance. So it's not a requirement for them. So you've got a chip, you've got an expiration number, and you've got the CVV. I'm sure you are all very familiar with this because you all have credit cards, and if you've used them, you will have been asked for, you know, any part of these things. There is also a magnetic strip. And funnily enough, if you're in America, the magnetic strip may come up quite a lot because the chip stuff has just not worked. Chip and pin has not worked in the same way in America as it has in Europe. And they're still using chip and signature. And sometimes you get asked to do a swipe, which is a bit mind-boggling. So if someone steals your pan, so PCI compliance is all about stealing the pan and protecting, obviously, the pan so it doesn't get stolen. If someone takes the pan off the magnetic strip, they can actually just take like a hotel, back in the day when hotel cards they're normally now RFID, but they used to have magnetic stripes. They could make a fake card out of your credit card number because the information on the strip basically contains the information that most of them need to go and buy something. And so they'll go to an electronic store, they'll buy a bunch of TVs, and then they'll take them and sell them. So effectively laundering the goods to get money back. So where can this go wrong, right? So anywhere where the credit card number moves around the payment system, it can be stolen, right? So it can be stolen from your customer, from you, if you've maybe given it to someone else by mistake. It can be stolen by the business, from the merchant, if the merchant's not protecting cards well enough. It can be stolen by the bank, credit card networks, issuing banks. So obviously, if you had to think about this for a little bit and you think who's most likely to protect the data really, really well, and it's going to be anyone with the name bank in them, right, or payment in them. And so arguably, if you think of your smallest, nicest, closest store, you would imagine that protecting credit card data is not their primary concern. Like, they want to make sure that they're not in trouble, but their business is to sell you the thing that you want. So that's why this particular presentation is really focusing in on the merchants, because the payment processors, they do nothing but protect payment data and credit card numbers effectively. Likewise with issuing banks and credit card networks. So really the kind of the fragile part is around the merchants. So obviously you swipe your card, you buy something online, and then on the back end, you're going to have all of these pieces of equipment, no matter which system, no matter which part of this flow you're in, there's going to be servers somewhere in the back. So what do they do with these card numbers? We talked about it a little bit. They sell the card numbers to make physical cards. They sell the card numbers to use online, and they're going to buy something that they can resell typically. If you can steal a card which has zip code or postcode or CVV, it's a little bit more valuable. So if by chance you went to a, which I hope you don't go, to a database, to like the dark web and look for stolen credit card databases, they will get a little bit more money if they have CVV, because that makes it a little bit easier to get through some of the online checks. So typically when you go to a store for the first time and you put in your credit card number, it's going to ask you for some kind of validation information, which it then sends back to the issuing bank and says, does this look like the person it's supposed to be? And they do their risk calculations and they go, yes, that seems right. So it's just a little bit more straightforward to fraudulently use a card if you have more than just the card number. So who's liable for these losses? So typically, it is not you as a consumer. So hang on, it didn't. It is not you. And I don't know if any of you have ever disputed a credit card transaction and said this wasn't me. But it is typically now the merchant or the issuing bank. So it used to be just the bank. And back in 2015, they made a change because all of the merchants were basically getting away with scot-free. They were taking bad credit cards and those transactions were going through, and then the banks on the other end were being, the customers were calling up and saying this wasn't me. And then the banks were having to give them the money back and they couldn't get the money back from the merchants. So in 2015, they said, okay, all you merchants, we've got all these chip cards now. If you take a chip card and your technology doesn't support the chip, because the chip is a little bit more secure and a little bit less prone to fraud, and you are instead taking this transaction as a swipe with the magnetic strip, if that transaction then gets reported as fraudulent, then you're responsible for it. You didn't have the chip hardware, you only had the swipe hardware, you didn't do whatever checks you should have done. So this is now on you. And where I was working back in the day, when this shift happened, we had something like in the first month, something like $1 million in fraudulent transactions that we were then suddenly responsible for. So it was a huge impact to merchants. And as a result, they put in a whole bunch more hardware that made them compatible with chip cards, which meant that the fraudulent risk was pushed back to the bank and fraud dropped considerably. So let's talk about card present payments. So this is when, obviously, you go into a store and you buy something with your card. And so you might scan the card, you might, in theory, swipe the card, astonishingly, and then hopefully someone is going to confirm that you're you. Nobody ever does, right? I mean, they do now in the UK. You can use a PIN. Again, in America, they haven't got a handle on pins, so it's signature. So you do a signature and nobody ever checks it. So it's sort of a bit valueless, the whole signature process. But how it works is you go into the merchant, you go through the payment process, that goes to the payment processor, which then says, okay, this card belongs to Bank X, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Check with Bank X to make sure the card's not stolen, that it's valid to use, and then it is, and then we'll take the money from your issuing bank, and the issuing bank will then send you a bill, and then we'll send the money to the merchant's bank. So that's basically the process relatively simply. There is a bit of a twist now in defining whether a card is present or not present. So it no longer, like it used to be, meant if you went into a shop, it was card present, right? So face-to-face card present. It's not really like that anymore because you can do buy online, pick up in store. So you're face-to-face with the merchant, but you've actually already paid for it online, which means it's a card not present transaction. So if you are physically engaging with a payment device, so if you're physically engaging with a swipe pad, or you've given them the card and they've read the chip or something like that, or you're using your digital wallet, that is a card present transaction. But if you've already paid for it in some other method and you just happen to be in there, that is likely card not present. It's a bit of a wrinkle. So, sometimes it's like going to the post office and picking up your Amazon package, right? They're not the merchant. They're just giving you something you've already paid for in a different way. So digital wallets. So these are really, really common now, and I can't imagine that any of you don't use them on a regular basis. So they're payment tools. It's not always Apple Pay or Google Pay. There are multiple other ones globally, right? There's Alipay and there's a whole bunch of other ones. I would say probably they're the most common ones, right? Is because they're on your phone or on your smartphone, and you always have that, and your phone is probably likely going to be Apple or Android, in which case you're using Apple Pay or Google Pay. So apparently by 2026, 60% of the global population will use digital wallets. And realistically, wouldn't be surprised if it was a little bit more than that. If you're really relying on a digital wallet and you never leave home with just if you only leave at home with your phone, which I certainly have done the other day, you just have to remember that leaves you with no backup option. So it is a real single point of failure. So I just had a friend of mine who had their son, so their kind of college-age son, had lost their phone, or their phone had died, or whatever it was. I think they'd stolen it. Either way, they didn't have their phone anymore. They had no way to call anyone other than hopefully they remembered someone's phone number. And nobody remembers anyone's phone number anymore. I always used to know everybody's. I barely know. I had to look up my own phone number the other day when I was filling out a form because I couldn't remember it, and it's so stupid. So I recommend everyone has a little wallet card that has physical phone numbers written down. Also useful, I'm sure, if you get arrested, although I gather, having watched telly the other day, if you do get arrested and you have to call anyone, they give you your phone to do it. But anyway, so this person didn't have a phone. He had no way to get a train ticket. He had no way to get on the tube. He had no way to buy anything. He had no way to call anybody. And luckily, he remembered one phone number and he was able to use that. In addition, the other day, I went to my local store, which sells everything. They had a power cut while we were in the store and everything went down. And so they could only take cash. And everyone's standing there going, none of us have cash. We only have our phones. So just bear it in mind, single point of failure. And, something to think about. PayPal is also a digital wallet. PayPal, Apple Cash, tools which are digital wallets which don't use credit cards for payment. We're not going to talk about because it's not PCI related. So you might be paying for something out of a crypto wallet or out of your bank account, but that is not PCI. So how does it work? So I'm sure all of you have done this at some point. You don't have to carry the card around. You enter it into the app once, and at the time you're entering it into the wallet, it is going through a verification process to make sure you're you, and that it ties itself to that device. Or your identity, so you can in theory actually I haven't tried that. You can in theory do I never pay with my iPad because it's too big, but I imagine there's some sort of with Apple Pay correlation there. Not all cards work with digital wallets, oddly. So I had one bank account when I moved back to UK from the US, and I had one bank account and I couldn't add the card into the credit card into the digital wallet. And actually that's just really annoying because we don't take our wallets with us anymore. So I actually switched bank accounts to one that did work with a digital wallet. So once it's in your wallet, that means that the issuer is comfortable that you have provided who you are, that you have the card in hand, and that you're the valid owner of the card. So when you use the digital wallet, the app sees really nothing. It sees that there's a transaction. It sees that the merchant wants some money, and what it gets is a kind of a blob from the digital wallet that says, "Here's a whole bunch of encrypted data which validates all of these things in the box," right? So it gives the other end the transaction it's related to, the amount, the person, and this encrypted blob that means that it's incredibly safe because the merchant doesn't see anything, right? And that's the trick, is to avoid the merchant, who's often going to be the weak link, from having to protect credit card data. They just don't need to, because all they get is this blob which they can't do anything with. And that means their PCI compliance is minimal, the risk is minimal, and so digital wallets, for lots of reasons, are much more popular now. The people that have to care about the number being safe are the people that actually have the ability to protect it. So physical skimmers still out there, not quite as common. So there are so many, when you go to the ATM machine and it says cover the keypad, you really should. And actually, when I was redoing this course the other day for LinkedIn Learning last year, I thought, God, I really do need to do better with covering the keypad, because people can insert skimmers into the device that reads the card. They're tiny, they're thin, you'd never know they were there. They capture the card. They can capture some information off the chip as well. They can capture the information off the swipe. And then when you put your PIN number in, they sometimes have little cameras and little pinholes that they've stuck up there. And so then they have your card data and you'll have your PIN number. So cover up your PIN when you're entering it anywhere. Less important when you're in a shop on a small machine, because they don't have that kind of overlay of the ATM machine that they can put things in. And also the general rule of thumb, which I do try and stick to, is don't use an ATM machine that is just kind of some spare. There's a lot of them in America. There's ATM machines in really dodgy corner stores that, that it's sort of, you can see all the network connections, right? You can see everything, and you know that it hasn't been physically protected and that no one is checking it. So something to just still be aware of. And if you're in If you are a merchant and you're using payment devices, you do have an obligation to actually inspect them. It's not always easy to do. I did work somewhere where, if you look at this, the device on the top left, which is a Verifone payment device, we did experience someone who installed a skimmer on one, and we were notified by the card brands that they were seeing a whole bunch of fraudulent payments come from one store. So we went back through 30 days of video and we saw people put it on, and it takes seconds. So it's still a thing. It's less of a thing, but it's still a thing. So that's why a lot of people say, let's not use things that we have to inspect. We're going to use very slick devices where the entire thing is managed by someone else. So whether it's a sum up device or a square device or something like that, again, the responsibility that the merchant has for protecting things is next to none. I mean, it's quite hard. It would be quite hard to put a skimmer on one of those little card chip readers on the top left. I mean, probably not impossible, but quite hard. Phone to phone payments, again, you really can't physically compromise those. So that means that the risk is low and the cost of PCI compliance is low, which means you do less controls, and everyone, that makes everyone pretty happy. If you go to a really big box store, and by big box store, I don't know, is that an expression? Is that an expression in Britain? I sometimes say things and I think people look at me like I'm talking garbage. So Currys, let's call Currys a big box store, right? Or B&Q or something. You go in there, they've probably got their own POS systems, right? Because they're big enough that they've developed these things that are extremely customized. And, they're using card readers, which may or may not encrypt the card or tokenize the card number. But it's entirely possible that they have a much bigger responsibility for protection of that card number through the flow. And in that case, the risk is much higher because it's no longer stopping at time of tap, and the costs are going to be much higher. So it's worth it if you're a big store like that, because they can say, hey, Natalie's been here again. Natalie's used the same card number. I've mapped her purchases with things that she bought and the card she bought last time. And so, they use it for a lot of information. But obviously, there's just more involved in that. So with card not present, the merchant is providing the checkout page. This is an entirely different thing, right? So we're going to Amazon. We're no longer dealing with physical systems. We are dealing with a checkout page of some sort. And so merchant's providing it, customers entering the number. On the back end, the merchant takes that number, or in some cases doesn't, we'll talk about that in a second, and sends it to the payment gateway. Payment's processed, they get the authorization, they close the order, and they send you a confirmation. That's called card not present. So obviously you're not face-to-face, you're not in a store, you're doing it online. So from a standpoint of the systems that are involved in this, you've got a server hosting the front end website. Now you might be using something like Shopify, right? So if you're using Shopify, it's not your server, it's Shopify's server. So there's a lot involved in that. We're just going to talk about in a minute with scoping, with whose problem is it to protect the front end server. I will always encourage my small clients to outsource as much of their flow as possible. So if they're using their front end servers, then is it possible that they can maybe use a hosted payment site, which we'll get to in a sec, or a hosted payment checkout page? So you've got front end servers, back end servers, you've got transaction databases, firewalls that get involved in it to make sure that only the right things come in, networks, payment processors, connections. There are a lot of pieces in this particular flow that can go wrong. Nearly as many as with the payment, the in-store payment, but it's a little bit different, because if you're a Currys, you also have, so you don't have the servers hosting the front end website, you have payment devices in your stores, and then the rest of it is really all the same. So there was in 2019, and also back, this is also extremely common in 2017, there were skimmers. So it's just like a physical skimmer. This is an online skimmer. So the malicious actors were inserting bad scripts into effectively vulnerable front-end servers, so that when the checkout page came up, either they put in an identical checkout page or they just sort of skimmed the data off the checkout page that was there. So the payment was going through. So you're typing your number in, right? And that number goes into a box. That box was then feeding it into the store checkout box and taking the number at the same time, right? So it's like one for you, one for them. And so it was capturing the card data and the CVV and the name and the expiration, sending it through so your order went through, you nothing to be suspicious about. But in the meantime, they'd had all of your information. In the recent PCI changes, they have addressed this and made that much harder to compromise. So if you're a little store and you've got your own systems, you can effectively outsource the checkout risks by using a payment processor iframe or checkout page or something. So in actual fact, when the customer is entering that number in the boxes, they're not entering the number in the boxes on your server, they're entering the number in the boxes directly on the payment processor end. So that means the merchant's slice of risk becomes much smaller. So they're really just passing off the responsibility. They can be very customizable now. Back in the day, e-commerce stores didn't like using them because they all did these beautiful pages, and then you get to the checkout page and it looked really clunky and really like something else. But now it's much easier and much more customizable, and you can sort of embed the smallest bits that just go straight to the payment page. You can also use an authorization system that enables Apple Pay or Google or PayPal or whatever you like. So that makes it easier for people to take payments, because the main thing about e-commerce sites is they want checkout to be seamless and pretty and make customers just happy to push the button that says buy. So who are the people that are overall involved in protecting credit card data? So it's merchants. We've already talked about them. That's the shop. It's not always a shop, right? It might be your accountant. So if you pay your accountant by credit card, that's a shop. It's a merchant, right? So there's lots of different ways. Your insurance company, also a merchant. You're paying them money to get something in return. Payment processors are what we talked about on back end. They're taking the payment. They're dealing with the respective banks and getting the money from one person into another person. You're the consumer, right? You're in the flow. And then there's service providers as a whole. The service providers, payment processors and banks are all service providers, but there are more things that can be a service provider. So payment processors, like I said, there's a customer, there's a seller. It says online seller here, but it could just as easily be an in-store seller. They handle the overall communication between the merchant and the issuing banks. And the merchants will use a payment gateway to connect to the payment processor, and then the payment processor kind of takes it from there and then sends them back a thumbs up, give them the stuff, or a thumbs down, don't give them the stuff. So how do they know who to send it to? And that's because something called a BIN, which is a bank issuer identification number. So these numbers on the front of your card, they know who they belong to. All American Expresses begin with a 3. Visa begins with 4, is it? MasterCard's a 5. So I have that the other? I had that the right way around. And then there's other things. I think Discover is a 6. So they know who the bank is, and every bank is going to have a different BIN. So it goes to them to get payment. So acquiring banks are the financial institutions that hold the bank account. So if you're a shop, your bank account that your merchant payments go into, that's your acquiring bank. They're going to make sure that you are doing PCI compliance correctly. They're going to deposit your funds. And so their biggest, for the purposes of this discussion, their biggest role is being responsible for checking compliance. You might often, if you're a merchant, you might also find that you get requests from the card brands to prove your compliance as well. Mostly, I think, because the acquiring banks do a little bit of outsourcing to those card brands because they have nice tools to check your compliance. So service providers can really be anything, right? So if you are using Shopify, Shopify is a service provider for you. If you're B&Q and you've got a whole rack of, I mean, more than a rack, a whole row of racks of servers sitting somewhere in a data center, the data center is a service provider. They have literally physical access to your databases, which contain credit card numbers. So there's a bunch of people, service providers all have to meet PCI compliance as well. And so if you are B&Q, you go to the data center and you go, show me all your PCI stuff. They're going to give you a bunch of other compliance things, but that's the thing that you need specifically to check that they are compliant. So compliant with what? So compliant with PCI. So between 1988 and 1998, they lost 750 million. The card brands lost 750 million dollars. Just Visa and MasterCard. So networks were growing, right? So the ability to do e-commerce grew. So in other words, the ability to use a fraudulent credit card online grew. People weren't really good at protecting their systems, so they could be compromised from, people accessing their systems and stealing the data. So suddenly they thought, okay, we really need to get a handle on this because it's really bad. So they came out originally with something called the CISP, and that got rolled out in 2001 by Visa. But there are a bunch of other standards, and just a little bit like privacy controls in America, where every state comes out with a different standard. Ideally, you want one standard, one ring to rule them all. So in 2004, they rolled out PCI DSS 1.0. So it was a combination of Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, and JCB that clubbed together, and they created the council in 2006. The council does, all things related to PCI. So 1.0 was in 2004. 21 years later, we're now on 4.0, which you might think there may have been more versions in 21 years, but there haven't been. So most recently, PCI 4.0 came out, and PCI 4.0 was really a big change. All of the versions, well, all the versions since PCI 3.x, which is all the ones I've been involved in, have milestones. And the milestones for 4.0 didn't change enormously. And they have these 6 milestones. Having done a fair amount of PCI, I'm not really entirely sure why they do these milestones. They kind of say, start here, but realistically, you don't do it consecutively. You don't do, okay, first I'm going to build a network, and then I'm going to do the account data. But it's fine to see them as a kind of high level, these are our general principles. And then the 6 milestones, there's then 12 requirement sections, which don't necessarily roll up to, 2 per milestone. Any requirement can be in any milestone, if that makes sense. Nearly all the PCI controls are really good best practices. As you can see from this list, especially those of you that have worked in IT, none of these things you wouldn't want to do, right? Whether it's account data or personal data or whatever it is, all of these things make very good sense. And that is, generally speaking, the way it goes with PCI, and they're getting better with not having some really stupid things in there. They made a lot of big changes in 4.0. So I'm going to just whiz through the 12 requirements. I'm not going to go into any detail on them. There are, I don't know, about 300 requirements in total. Like that's something. I do have courses on LinkedIn. They're very long and probably quite dull. If you want to go into them in great detail, they're there. But really, the PCI website is your best resource if you want to dig into them. But so 1 and 2, install a main network security controls, supply secure configurations. So if you have a network that's part of your flow, so let's say you have servers and databases, those need to be in appropriately segmented and protected networks with appropriately controlled firewalls and firewall rules, and they get reviewed, and so on and so forth. Secure configurations, don't roll out servers or firewalls or PCI payment devices or anything that has default passwords. Make sure they're hardened. Again, none of these are bad things. Requirements 3 to 4. Protecting stored account data. So if you don't get the data at all, all of Section 3 is out of scope for you. So if you outsource your payment process through, using one of those hardware devices or using an outsourced checkout page, this is 3 is really not anything that you control. And likewise 4, because most of those machines, the transmission of the data is going to be handled by the payment gateway, and therefore the payment processor. But if you're not doing those things, these things come in scope for you. We'll talk about scope in a minute. 5 and 6 is, get your antivirus and make sure that you are maintaining, right? You can't just roll stuff out and never look at it again and say it'll be fine, and then you realize you've got 1,000 critical patches a year later and everything is incredibly vulnerable. So no malicious software, and then make sure you're not vulnerable to risk down the line. Access restrictions make perfect sense. All of you should be familiar with the principle of least privilege, making sure that users are identifiable and they authenticate correctly, and subsequently in another control that any actions they do are logged and so they're accountable for them is all important. Physical access to cardholder data, again, if you don't collect cardholder data, you are not liable for any of Section 9. Section 9 is very key to things like data centers or organizations that store their own systems, their own card data for whatever reason. So if you have a POS system in your store and your POS system stores payment card data for the day, you have to make sure that's physically protected. So literally someone can't come in and take the drive. You have to log and monitor all access. This is really hard to do, and it's got harder to do. And that's why in an ideal world, you outsource all data collection to someone like a payment processor or a bank, and you just, as a small merchant or any size merchant, do not get involved in storing data, and that way you don't have to log access to data. You still have to log access to systems that are in your payment flow that are critical, but not the cardholder data. Monitoring and testing is quite obvious. And then the final one is informational policies and programs. So do you have a security policy? Do people have to read it and acknowledge it? Do you have, so I think it was Maria, in your software dev lifecycle, if you're developing software that is part of the PCI flow, there has to be an SDLC policy, people have to do training. There's just a whole bunch of things around governance related to this. So, okay, you're starting to do PCI. How many requirements do you have to do? So all, whatever it is, 292 or 300 and something, I can't remember what it is specifically. It's a lot. They all start in scope. And then what you do, your goal is to make them all out of scope. So if you don't have POS devices, anything around POS devices and checking POS devices, you don't have to do. It's out of scope. You don't have them. If you're an e-commerce platform, you have no physical devices, out of scope. If you don't do any PAN storage because you use outsourced checkout pages, or you use hardware from SumUp, you don't have to deal with any of the requirements related to PAN storage. If you have data centers, you don't have anything around physical security. So there's ways to get things out of scope. And scope is really key. Scope is everything for PCI compliance, because anything that's in scope has to meet PCI compliance. Anything that is out of scope does not. For those who are doing third-party risk management, and someone gives you a PCI attestation of compliance, and you're actually not dealing with them for PCI data, you might be dealing them PII data. You can't really accept that unless it covers all of their systems, because PCI only cares about credit card data. They don't care about anything else. They don't care about PII, don't care about health data. They simply don't care. So PCI compliance only speaks to credit card systems, the systems in the flow. And because people do everything to get everything out of scope, it might not apply to your entire database of health records. So if you think about this, how to get things out of scope. So you've got your applications, or how do you know what's in scope? So things that are obviously in scope is going to be your payment application. If you have one, if you're Currys, you have a payment application, the systems that application runs on, the networks that they run on, and your locations where those all start. So you can see why, if you can narrow that down to just a network cable that plugs into your SumUp device, that might be ideal. So here's an example, right? You've got a POS system. I mean, this is an old clunky one, but they still exist and you will see them. You've got a POS system that in turn talks to the backend server, and that in turn communicates with the payment processor. And they take a card swipe on the left and that sends the money here. And I just did a PCI project with a bunch of gas stations in Central America, well, not Central America, Central Northern America, so Missouri. And they literally had systems just like this. So they had a server and they had like a PC that was connected to the thing for no good reason that I could tell. And then there was all sorts of weird, clunky networking. So this is not uncommon. Just because it's not what you see a lot, it doesn't mean that it's not going to be there. So where's the data stored? Is it stored in a database somewhere? Where does the database live? So, trying to figure that out. Okay, so and then you go, okay, let's just talk about what's absolutely not in scope, right? We have physical locations. The physical locations are completely unrelated. We have an office, right? We have an office. We may take credit cards in our store, but our office has nothing to do with credit cards. They don't see any, they don't have any payment devices, they are out of scope. And those networks are out of scope. There is no connection between network A and network B. And our email system has no relation to PCI. We don't send cards through email. So just trying to figure things in and out of scope. So reporting, depending on what size you are, how many credit cards you take, and we'll go in that in a second, you have to do one of a variety of things. And if any of you have been dealing with PCI compliance, you'll be used to hearing about ROCs, SAQs, AOCs, QSAs, ISAs. I had someone say, why isn't it an ROC and why is it an SAQ? I don't know. I don't know why they're pronounced differently. They just are. And these are things you'll get used to hearing. I used to be an ISA, so I was an ISA for Equifax. So I got sent to PCI school for Equifax so that I could do multiple PCI assessments for them, which then had to get effectively checked by another organization because we were classified as a service provider. And even though we didn't, it was a long, complicated story. But anyway, we also had QSAs come in to do our assessment as well because we were required to do a ROC. So if you're a merchant level 4, so if you're a small store, less than 20,000 transactions a year, you're level 4. And then it goes up to level 3, level 2, level 1. If you're a level 1, 6 million transactions a year, I mean, you can imagine clearly Amazon is level 1, right? They're required to have, they're going to be required to have, I should have done that on the other order, something that's completed by an ISA or a QSA. So in other words, someone who has gone to PCI school has to complete their report on compliance, and they have to do a report on compliance. You can't do a self-assessment questionnaire if you're a level 1. You can if you're level 2, 3, and 4. So obviously there's an enormous cost difference in obtaining effectively an external audit. It's called an assessment, but whatever, from a QSA or sending someone internally to go and do PCI training. So, level 1, if you've got 6 million transactions, you can probably afford it. And you've probably got a big budget for compliance in any case. So there's a lot of different SAQs. So again, to look up the specific ones, I recommend that you go to the PCI website. I am working on one right now, which is an SAQ BIP. So it is a store, again, in America, weirdly in Missouri again. And they have got a physical device that connects to a network that then speaks to the payment processor that then speaks to the device in store. So there's no physical communication between the in-store checkout device and the payment device. So based on the criteria that makes it a BIP, because it's a B, but it's going over internet network. If it went over a phone line, which back in the day they used to be there, it would be a B. So there's various different things. SAQD is all of the controls. It's everything, which you obviously can still make things out of scope within that set, but you would go to basically a flow chart and figure out which one is most suitable if you're below level 1. So the B has a least set of controls, the CVT, which is basically virtual terminal. So someone who might be taking phone orders, but entering them into a payment gateway. So entering them into a hosted tool, not into your internal tool, for example, and then D. So B's got fewest controls, and then C's got more, and D's got all of them. And if you're Currys, you're going to be a D, right? Because you've probably got your own payment application. You're possibly storing credit card data, not a requirement for D, but if you do store credit card data, you absolutely are doing a D. And again, you're going to be spending a lot more money on compliance, and you have much greater risk. So just very, very quickly, because we've only got a few minutes left, PCI development. So the PCI 4.0 was finally published at the end of 22. It was supposed to be done in 2020, but then COVID and lots of delays, as you can be expected. I think it's 2020. As of March 31st, 2024, it was required. There were a bunch of controls that weren't required until March 31st, 2025, so 2 weeks ago. And I was speaking to an old customer, and they were going, well, how do you do this one? And I think I was talking to them in February. I said, well, I'm working with another client. We're not going to do this one this year. You go, well, how are they not doing it this year? I go, because you don't have to do it till March 31st. And they, while I was talking to them, were talking to their assessor to say, we need to bring this forward into March so that we don't have to meet this control. So they would have to meet it for next year. But it's a point in time audit. There are some things that are over the period of time, but generally speaking, it's a point in time audit. So they only had to be compliant with the things they had to be compliant with by March 31st, and they were going to do it in March as opposed to April. But now they're all in scope, and they're difficult as well, some of them. So the changes in 4.0, they were trying to reflect that people don't necessarily use passwords in the same way. They don't have logging in the same way. They just generally don't do the same things as they did for PCI version 3, which I think came out in 2014 or something. So, it's been a significant change, and there really were a lot of changes in the 4.0 upgrade, which isn't really particularly relevant to you unless you were really familiar with 3.x. So, trust me, there were a lot of changes, and they also made a big change in the way people could respond to controls. Instead of it being pass or fail, you could say, here's an entire essay on how this should be a pass for us. So if you want to know more about PCI, go to the resource hub, download the documents, especially if you have to do some PCI compliance. This is where you're going to start, right? As you go to the PCI DSS resource hub, and then you're going to say, okay, I did just from a vague look, it looks like we're this kind of merchant where you have this many transactions, and we're going to have to do some work, and someone's going to need to work with us. You can't see the link, I don't think, but it's PCI standards, PCIsecuritystandards.org is really where you need to go from there. And if you have, if you have LinkedIn Learning, I have courses available on LinkedIn. Any questions? It's like 1,000 slides and 1,000 bits of things to know. But if anyone has any questions, we have a couple of minutes.
Thanks for that, Laura. Any links to the standards and your courses and things sent to us, because we'll put them available with the recording.
Okay, so yes, I will do that. I will send that.
Cool. Question from me, just pure curiosity, because it was always baffling when I've travelled to America. Why don't they do chip and pin? Like, is it just
I have an answer for you. No, I have
change?
an answer for you. So
good. That was my question too.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's a really great question, and everyone's like, "What the hell?" Okay, so America is very odd in that it has something like, and I'm just paraphrase the number, 15,000 banks. So every village has its own credit union or local bank, or like Bank of Dave. If anyone's seen that film Bank of Dave, right? Imagine every town has got Bank of Dave. So when they came out with chip and pin, there were 15,000 people, 50,000 organizations. None of them could agree on the protocol and all this kind of thing, and blah, blah, blah. And I don't know if they will ever get to it. So as a result, chip and pin just isn't a thing. And as a consequence of this, that means that there's just probably likely to be more fraud associated with it, because no one's checking the signature. So there's inserting the chip, which reduces the risk of the swipe being stolen, but you can steal stuff from a chip. It's not impossible. And because you're not putting in the PIN, that chip data can then in theory be fraudulently used again, whereas it's much harder where you're doing chip and PIN, because there's a whole thing that goes on with the PIN validation that helps with that. Too many banks.
Because I was last time I went to America last year, and I was really shocked. I was like, you want me to sign? I was like, I would expect America to be ahead, you know.
You would think, no, but I'm afraid everyone thinks America would be ahead a lot of things, and in many things it's just simply not. And I still have an American credit card I use, and I take it to the petrol station. And if I can tap it, it's fine. But sometimes the tap doesn't work and I have to insert it. And then it spits out a little piece of paper. And they're like, oh my God, a piece of paper. Like no one's ever seen the paper spit out the top. And I ask for a signature. And I go, you don't really. And they will always ask me for it. I go, no one's ever going to ask you for the signature. But, you know, I sign it and no one has a pen.
It's like when you tip and you have to physically write the number on a piece of paper. You're like, surely you're going to capture this digitally. Surely you don't want me to write how many pounds and pence I'm tipping you on paper.
Exactly. Yeah. No, none of it makes any sense. But there it is. And also that whole thing of where in America they take your credit card away and they swipe it in the back, and then in the process they swipe another thing. Whereas there's a big difference when you come to Europe and, you know, they're taking your payment at the table, you know, if you're in a restaurant. And so again, you're losing another opportunity for someone taking an extra swipe of that card by doing it right in front of you with the device.
So just to like a follow-on question for that. So does that make PCI compliance a lot harder in America? Like it must cost a lot more overall every year because of that?
Because the controls are the controls, right? There isn't a control that says you have to use a PIN. Where that changes is in the fraud shift, probably, right? Because the PCI is about protecting the credit card data, and it doesn't allow you to store the PIN. It doesn't allow you to store the CVV. You can store the expiration, and you can store, you know, pieces of the number, but you're not allowed to store what's called sensitive authentication data, authorization data. So you're not required to use a chip device. You're not required to collect a PIN. You are effectively now, because of the liability shift in 2015. If you don't support chip payments, you will be likely to, like every criminal is going to come to your shop and use their fraudulently stolen swipe card to buy whatever it is you're selling.
It's just going to, like you said, more money in fraudulent activity.
More money in fraudulent activity, which obviously is going to hit your bottom line. But the PCI controls are the PCI controls, and none of them are related to requiring you to have a chip.
So in terms of, so you mentioned the Apple Pay scenario, because they also don't have that over there either, do they? They do. You can't use it in the shop though, can you?
It depends on the shop, but yes, you can. They absolutely support Apple Pay and Google Pay. Again, because it's just easier, ultimately becomes easier for everybody, and everyone loves swiping their watch and all that kind of stuff. It just, again, depends on the shop.
So it encrypts the data before it goes to the merchant?
Yes. No, it encrypts the data. It may never go to the merchant, right? It encrypts the data at the time of swipe or tap.
Yeah, so the data that gets to the merchant is encrypted.
Yes. And so it travels across the merchant's network in an encrypted fashion. And the key about data encryption is who has the key, right? So again, to use my Currys example, Currys probably has the encryption key, right? In which case they are responsible from start to finish protecting that data. If you're the merchant and you're using a payment device, which at the time of tap swipe chip encrypts it with a key you don't have, then you are not responsible for that data. The payment gateway processor hardware device is.
Right. Okay. That's what I wanted to. That as I want to try to make sense of that when you said it. So thank you.
Yeah. No, it's all a bit weird.
But thank you. It's making what I would say is probably you kept me really engaged for like a subject that.
That's because I got far too many slides. I was whipping through, and
it was very good. Thank you.
My email address I've taken off there, but laura@angelcybersecurity.com. So if you have questions and things, you let me know.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Laura.
You're welcome. I'm exhausted now from all that PCI chat. I'll talk to you all soon. I'm going to go buy something with a credit card.